The Vukovar Massacre, also known as the Vukovar Hospital Massacre or the Vukovar Massacre, was the killing of Croatian prisoners of war and civilians by Serb paramilitaries and the Yugoslav People's Army at the Vukovar farm southeast of Vukovar on 20 November 1991, during the Croatian War of Independence. The massacre occurred shortly after Vukovar's capture by the JNA, Croatian Serb Territorial Defense, and paramilitaries from neighboring Serbia. It was the largest massacre of the war, and the worst war crime in Europe since World War II up until that time. In the final days of the battle, the evacuation of the Vukovar hospital was negotiated between Croatian authorities, the JNA and the European Community Monitor Mission in cooperation with the International Committee of the Red Cross. The JNA subsequently refused the ICRC access to the hospital despite the agreement and removed approximately 300 people from its premises. The group, largely consisting of Croats but also including Serbs, Hungarians, Muslims and 2 foreign nationals who fought on the side of the Croatian National Guard, was initially transported to the JNA barracks in Vukovar. Several prisoners were identified as hospital staff and removed from the group to be returned to the hospital, while the rest of them were transported to the Vukovar farm south of Vukovar. Once at the farm, the prisoners were beaten for several hours before the JNA pulled its troops from the site, leaving the prisoners in the custody of the Croatian Serb II and Serbian paramilitaries. The prisoners were then taken to a prepared site, shot in groups of 10 to 20 and buried in a mass grave. The mass grave was discovered in October 1992 and guarded by the United Nations Protection Force, which had deployed to the area earlier that year. In 1996, 200 sets of remains were exhumed from the grave by International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia investigators. Croatia believes 61 others were buried in a different grave on the site, while ICTY prosecutors believe that figure stands at 60. The ICTY convicted 2 JNA officers in connection with the massacre, and also tried former Serbian President Slobodan Milosevic for a number of war crimes, including those committed at Vukovar. Milosevic died in prison before his trial could be completed. ICTY trials of Croatian Serb political leader Goran Hadžić and Serbian Radical Party leader Vojislav Šešelj for various war crimes, including those committed in Vukovar, are ongoing. Several former members of the Croatian Serb II and Serbian paramilitary units have been tried by the Serbian judiciary and convicted for their involvement in the massacre. In February 2015, the International Court of Justice ruled that the massacre did not constitute genocide. The site of the mass grave is marked by a monument, and the storage building used at Vukovar farm to hold the prisoners in captivity before their execution was rebuilt as a memorial center in 2006. Since then, the center has been visited by 500,000 tourists. Background: in 1990, ethnic tensions between Serbs and Croats worsened after the electoral defeat of the government of the Socialist Republic of Croatia by the Croatian Democratic Union. The Yugoslav People's Army confiscated Croatia's territorial defense weapons to minimize resistance. On 17 August, the tensions escalated into an open revolt of the Croatian Serbs, centered on the predominantly Serb-populated areas of the Dalmatian hinterland around Nin, northeast of Split, parts of the Lika, Kordun, Banovina and eastern Croatia. In January 1991, Serbia, supported by Montenegro and Serbia's provinces of Vojvodina and Kosovo, unsuccessfully tried to obtain the Yugoslav presidency's approval for a JNA operation to disarm Croatian security forces. The request was denied, and a bloodless skirmish between Serb insurgents and Croatian special police in March prompted the JNA itself to ask the federal presidency to give it wartime authority and declare a state of emergency. Even though the request was backed by Serbia and its allies, the JNA request was refused on 15 March. Serbian President Slobodan Milosevic, preferring a campaign to expand Serbia rather than to preserve Yugoslavia with Croatia as a federal unit, publicly threatened to replace the JNA with a Serbian army and declared that he no longer recognized the authority of the federal presidency. The threat caused the JNA to abandon plans to preserve Yugoslavia in favor of expanding Serbia as the JNA came under Milosevic's control. The first casualties of the conflict occurred by the end of March. In early April, leaders of the Serb revolt in Croatia declared their intention to unite the areas under their control with Serbia. These areas were viewed by the government of Croatia as breakaway regions. At the beginning of 1991, Croatia had no regular army. To bolster its defense, Croatia doubled its police numbers to about 20,000. The most effective part of the Croatian police force was a 3,000-strong special police comprising 12 battalions organized along military lines. There were also 9,000–10,000 regionally organized reserve police in 16 battalions and 10 companies, but they lacked weapons. In response to the deteriorating situation, the Croatian government established the Croatian National Guard in May by expanding the special police battalions into 4 all-professional guards brigades. Under the control of the Croatian Ministry of Defense and commanded by retired JNA General Martin Spegelj, the 4 Guards brigades comprised approximately 8,000 troops. The reserve police, also expanded to 40,000, was attached to the ZNG and reorganized into 19 brigades and 14 independent battalions. The Guards brigades were the only units of the ZNG that were fully equipped with small arms. Throughout the ZNG there was a lack of heavier weapons, and there was poor command and control structure above the brigade level. The shortage of heavy weapons was so severe that the ZNG resorted to using World War II-era arms taken from museums and film studios. At the time, the Croatian weapons stockpile consisted of 30,000 small arms purchased abroad and 15,000 previously owned by the police. To replace the personnel lost to the Guards brigades, a new 10,000-strong special police was established. Prelude. After Croatia launched the Battle of the Barracks to capture JNA facilities in Croatia on 14–15 September, the JNA launched a small-scale operation against Vukovar to relieve the city garrison. At the same time, it began large-scale mobilization in preparation for its campaign in Croatia. It was met with widespread refusal of mobilized personnel to report to their designated units, desertions and an overall lack of enthusiasm for the campaign. This resulted in low troop availability, forcing the JNA to deploy fewer infantry units. Response to the mobilization was particularly poor in central Serbia, where only 26% of those called up reported for service. The JNA's offensive operations, directly associated with the campaign in the East Croatian region of Slavonia, were launched on 20 September. The assault on Croatian positions in Vukovar gradually became the main effort of the campaign as the JNA was repeatedly unable to capture the city. The fighting in and around Vukovar lasted months and eventually drew in the JNA's main armoured force, which had previously been slated to advance west towards Serb-held areas in western Slavonia. In addition to relieving its Vukovar garrison, the JNA wished to dissipate the Croatian forces in the city so that they would not pose any threat to its rear in the event that the campaign progressed west of Vinkovci. The JNA forces around Vukovar were reinforced by local Serb Manta units and Serbian paramilitary volunteers who were meant to replace those reservists that had failed to respond to their call-up. The volunteers were often motivated by ethnic hatred, looted countless homes and committed numerous atrocities against Croatian civilians. After more than 2 months of fighting, the Croatian forces in the city surrendered on the 18th of November. Vukovar suffered great destruction from JNA artillery and rocket barrages against the town. By the end of the battle, over 700,000 shells and other missiles had been fired at Vukovar at a rate of up to 12,000 a day. Timeline. Evacuation arrangements. On the 17th of November, Major General Andrea Rassetta, the commander of the JNA 5th Military District, notified the European Community Monitor Mission that the JNA accepted in principle the quick evacuation of vulnerable persons from Vukovar. At the time, it was estimated that there were about 400 people trapped in the city's hospital, but the actual number was later discovered to be about 450. This included about 40 patients receiving treatment for severe injuries sustained over the preceding few days and about 360 patients recovering from wounds suffered earlier on. In addition to these individuals, some civilians had taken shelter in the hospital in the final days of the battle. They moved there expecting to be evacuated from the city, even though the hospital itself sustained daily artillery bombardment. Furthermore, a number of Croatian troops took refuge in the hospital posing as patients or staff. On the 18th of November, the Tripartite Commission, consisting of representatives of Croatia, the JNA and the ECMM, discussed methods of evacuation with representatives of the International Committee of the Red Cross, the Médecins Sans Frontières and the Malteser International. On the night of 19 November, Rassetta and Croatian Health Minister Andrija Hebrang signed an agreement on the evacuation. The agreement guaranteed that the evacuees would travel via the route Lužic suburb Bogdanovci Marinci Zadine Junction Nustavinkovci. They were to be handed over to international authorities at the Zadine Junction. The hospital was to be placed under the control of the ICRC and the ECMM was to oversee the entire operation. Hebrang notified the hospital director Vesna Bosanic of the agreement and told her that ICRC teams would arrive. That evening Sinisa Glavašević, a radio reporter who had covered the entire course of the siege from within the city, broadcast his final report from the hospital. Glavašević himself hoped to leave the city with the ICRC, fearing for his life should the Serb paramilitaries capture him. Takeover of the hospital. On the morning of the 19th of November, the ECMM became aware that organized resistance had ceased in Vukovar, but it did not receive any information on the fate of the hospital patients. Consequently, the head of the ECMM, Ambassador Dirk-Jan van Houten, contacted Rassetta asking him to intervene on the ECMM's behalf. That day, a JNA unit arrived at the hospital and Bosanic was taken to meet JNA Colonel Mile Markasic. According to Bosanic, Markasic told her that he was not obligated by the evacuation agreement. Even though the ICRC was not granted access to Vukovar by JNA officers at the scene, in the early evening of the 19th of November, ICRC representative Nicholas Borsinger managed to reach the hospital claiming he had an appointment with a general. Once there, Borsinger found a JNA captain in charge of the facility who agreed to grant the ICRC access. Borsinger then rejoined the ICRC convoy that was moving towards the hospital to evacuate it. The hospital was also toured by French reporter Agnès Varamian that day, and there she recorded an interview with Jean-Michel Nicolia, a wounded Frenchman who fought alongside Croatian forces in Vukovar. Varamian offered Nicolia a press pass to try to get him out of the city, but he refused. On the morning of the 20th of November, the ICRC convoy reached Vukovar, only to be stopped at a bridge near the hospital. An armored vehicle blocked access to the bridge leading to the hospital, and a JNA officer at the scene, Major Veselin Slivacanin, refused to let the ICRC pass. In order to facilitate negotiations with the ICRC at the scene, BBC reporter Martin Bell volunteered his interpreter. In a confrontation recorded by television cameras, Evacuation told the ICRC personnel, "This is my country, we have conquered this. This is Yugoslavia, and I am in command here." The ECMM personnel that had arrived at the Zadine junction to meet the returning convoy were informed by the JNA that the evacuees would instead be turned over to them in Bosanski Semac, in northern Bosnia, on the 22nd of November. While Evacuation held back the convoy, the prisoners were smuggled out of the hospital in buses in another direction. In total, approximately 300 people were taken away from the hospital. Vukovar farm later on the 20th of November. Evacuation and Colonel Nebojša Zapavković informed the press that the JNA would provide buses to transport the wounded out of Vukovar. Instead, at about 10:30, the buses took the prisoners to the JNA barracks on the southern edge of Vukovar, where 15 men were separated from the group and returned to the hospital after being identified as hospital staff. During their stay in the barracks, the Croatian Serb-2 and Serbian paramilitaries threatened the prisoners. Croatian Serb leaders opposed moving the prisoners to detention facilities in Serbia, claiming they wished to prosecute them for alleged crimes committed against Serbs. After spending 2 hours at the barracks, the buses took the prisoners to the Vukovar farm near the village of Grabovo. The group largely consisted of Croats, but also included several ethnic Serbs, Muslims, ethnic Hungarians, the French national Nicolia, and one German national who fought in defense of Vukovar. It also included Raseta's nephew, who worked at the Vukovar hospital pharmacy at the time. The group of taken to Vukovar consisted of 261 people. Sources conflict whether the group included 1 or 2 women, one of whom was 5 months pregnant. The age of the prisoners ranged from 16 to 72, and the youngest among the group was 16-year-old Igor Kasic. Once they reached Vukovar, 10 kilometers away from Vukovar, the captives were ordered from the buses one by one and forced to run the gauntlet past dozens of JNA troops and Serb paramilitaries towards a farm storage building. Slavko Dokmanović, a former mayor of Vukovar, was one of the armed men involved in beating prisoners. As the captives were beaten, they were also stripped of their personal belongings, money and jewelry. Over the course of the day, the JNA military police failed to prevent soldiers of the Croatian Serb-2 and Serbian paramilitaries from beating the prisoners in the storage building. They were beaten using sticks, rifle butts, chains, baseball bats, and in one instance a wounded prisoner was beaten with his own crutches. By sundown, at least 2 men were beaten to death. In addition, one of the captors shot 5 prisoners, including one Frenchman, who is presumed to be Nicolia. 7 or 8 men were returned to Vukovar on orders of the JNA, presumably released at the intervention of their Serb neighbors. Ultimately, Kasic ordered the JNA military police to withdraw from the farm, leaving the prisoners in the custody of a Croatian Serb-2 unit led by Miroljub Vujović, commander of the Croatian Serb-2 in Vukovar, and the Leva Supodruka paramilitary unit. Leva Supodruka was a volunteer unit set up by the Serbian Radical Party in Sid, Serbia, and subordinated to the JNA's 1st Guards Mechanized Brigade. At about 1800, the prisoners were divided into groups. Each group of 10 to 20 was loaded onto a truck and transported several hundred meters from the building towards a wooded ravine. When the prisoners reached the previously prepared execution site, they were shot and buried in a mass grave using a bulldozer. After 15 to 20 minutes, the truck would return empty to pick up the next group. The final group of prisoners was executed just outside the farm building itself. By 2200 that evening, all the prisoners had been killed. Sources variously report their number at about 260, but up to 264 in total. Croatian authorities believed the total figure stands at 261, while the ICTY prosecutors indicated there were approximately 260 victims. The massacre was the most severe individual war crime committed in Europe since World War II. Up until that point,